Okay, this is the James Beckwourth Man and Myth Jamestown reading test. While I am reading this out loud, I am also going to give some hints on what you should be annotating. Okay? So, man and the myth. You know that a myth is some sort of lie, right? Suppose you wanted to learn all you could about the American West in the early 19th century, through the eyes of just one person. Choosing the life of explorer Jim Beckwourth, so that's the guy we're going to be talking about, would be a good way to do it. At one time or another, Beckwourth did just about everything a man in the pioneer days could do. So I'm going to think about pioneer. What do you know about pioneer days? Think about it and write some stuff down. Okay? So pioneer days, they did a lot with their hands, a lot of building. Log cabins in the woods, I sort of think of with pioneer. Beckwourth would get bored with one adventure and then move on to the next. Over the course of his life, he was a beaver trapper, trading post owner, wilderness explorer, and a gold prospector. He also found excitement as a horse thief and a pioneer guide. So we're going to underline all these because he did all this stuff. Beaver trapper, trading post owner, wilderness explorer, gold prospector, horse thief, and a pioneer guide. Beckwourth also had extensive contact with Native American peoples. Sometimes he fought on their side, and sometimes he fought against them. He even became a war chief for the Crow. So we know he was also a war chief. Although there were other African Americans who lived fascinating lives in the Wild West too, only Beckwourth was featured in a book written during his lifetime. The book was his autobiography as told to Thomas D. Bonner. It was titled, The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, Mountaineer, Scout, and Pioneer, and Chief of the Crow Nation of Indians. Okay? So although there were other, as we know that he's African American, there were other African Americans who lived fascinating lives. Only Beckwourth was the one written about. Okay, so notice how after I've read something, I'm going back and rereading it. Okay, that's what we're going to want to do. The book opens with his birth in 1798 to a white Virginia farmer and a black slave mother. And it details the many twists and turns of his life over the next 50 years. So yes, a person could learn a lot about the American West from this man who began life as a slave and went on to become a legend in his own time. He began life as a slave. Of course, some of the stories you would learn might not exactly be true. That is because Beckwourth's life story is a combination of reality and myth. Okay, so we know that everything we're going to hear about him is reality and myth. He is partly to blame, since he was always willing to embellish his own adventures. Okay, so he did not quite tell the truth about his adventures. He probably exaggerated. If he and 50 other men were attacked by 50 enemies, Beckwourth might retell the story so that he and just 10 other men were up against 500 enemies. Because of this type of exaggeration, people called him the gaudy liar. This label, however, might be taken either as a slur or a compliment. It was a slur when used by an outsider who was perhaps jealous of Beckwourth's adventures. It was a compliment when used by his partners in the Mountain Men who shared tall tales with him at their annual writing winter meeting place. For these men, the biggest sin was being a bore, and no one could accuse Beckwourth of that. All those who heard his stories acknowledged that the man was a master storyteller. So even though he embellished his stories, he was a master storyteller. Exaggerations aside, the facts of Beckwourth's life are fascinating enough. As a child growing up in first Virginia and then Missouri, Beckwourth fell in love with the outdoor life. When he was a young man, I'm going to underline that so we know he's an outdoors guy. When he was a young man, his father gave him his emancipation papers, ending Beckwourth's enslavement. So emancipation just means to be freed. Okay? Still, as an African American from a region where slavery was still in force, Beckwourth felt that a more complete freedom waited for him in the untamed West. He joined a beaver trapping expedition and headed toward the mountains. There he became an expert marksman and a skilled survivalist. One day, in 1828, while out trapping, Beckwourth was captured by Crow warriors. Okay, so we know that he was captured by Crow warriors. There are several different versions of exactly how this happened, but Beckwourth soon found himself living among the Crow. It turned out to be a good fit. First of all, Beckwourth felt relieved to be away from the racial discrimination he had experienced throughout his life. In time, he gained great influence among the Crow. He joined in many of their battles, rose in status to become a war chief, and married several Crow women. He stayed with the Crow for nearly 8 years. Then, in search of new adventure and fame, Beckwourth joined the Missouri Volunteers of the United States Army in their war against the Seminole of Florida. So he became a volunteer in the U.S. Army. Okay, so he lived among the Crow. Just kind of take a minute. Sometimes I like to go back and refresh what I underlined. He was captured by Crow, but then he lived among them. So it said it turned out to be a good fit. He was glad to be away from the racial discrimination. Okay, so just some strategies I just did there. Just kind of went back, reread. I looked at what I underlined, kind of refreshed it in my mind. Okay? He stayed in Florida 10 months, doing a bit of scouting and carrying mail. He found the long periods without adventure to be unbearable. Sounds like he wasn't doing much fighting in the war. He was scouting and carrying mail. However, so he returned to the West in 1838. I wanted excitement of some kind, he said, but he didn't care what kind it was. Beckwourth couldn't even get a thrill by stealing horses from the Seminole. The Seminole had no horses worth stealing. Or I should certainly have exercised my talents for the benefit of the United States. Okay, for the next few paragraphs, I want you to go back. I want you to underline things. And then when you're done, go back and review what you underlined, maybe reread a few things like I've been doing for the rest of this. Okay, I want you to employ those strategies. Beckwourth traveled to St. Louis, which was a major city on the edge of the western frontier. This was the place where trappers brought their furs to trade for goods and money. The Mississippi River also brought travelers and provided easy access to outer settlements. Beckwourth probably came to St. Louis to make connections, make money, find excitement, or all three. He wasn't in town very long before he met up with an old friend named Louis Vasquez, who was getting ready to set up a trade with the Cheyenne, Arafro, and Sioux. Vasquez was happy to bring Beckwourth into their plans because of Beckwourth's knowledge of the Native American culture and his close association with the Crow. Beckwourth was named the group's agent in charge, and he quickly formed a friendly relationship with the Cheyenne that would last for many years. After a time, Beckwourth grew tired of working for Vasquez, so he moved on. He married Louisa Sandoval and started his own trading post, which later grew to become present-day Pueblo, Colorado. However, Beckwourth couldn't settle down for long. For the next several years, he moved from one activity to the next. He served as a scout, panned for gold, and spent a good deal of time crisscrossing California. Just before the California gold rush in 1849, he discovered a low pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains that was much easier and safer to cross than the dangerous Donner Pass. He and some friends spent half a year building a road that could be used by gold seekers and settlers bringing their families to the west. The merchants of Marysville, California, paid Beckwourth to guide wagon trains to their town. 2 decades later, Beckwourth's trail would become the route over the Sierra Nevada mountains that was used by the Western Pacific Railroad. The pass, which is a few miles north of Reno, is still known as Beckwourth Path. Jim Beckwourth died in 1866. The details of his death were, like the man himself, obstructed by legend. No one knows for sure how he died, but that didn't keep people from making up stories. According to one, he was poisoned by the Crow when he refused to return to them and become their leader. Others say he was trying to negotiate peace between the Crow and the local white settlers when he became ill and died. The Crow treated him as an honored warrior by leaving his body on a platform high in a tree. It gave him a splendid view of the land he had traveled through and helped to shape. Okay, so now that we're done reading, I want you to go back. Hopefully you underlined a few things in 7, 8, and 9. Review what you underlined, maybe even reread some parts here to get a better understanding. Okay, just like I did in the previous parts. And then you can answer the questions.